What do you think specifically about this ETF? I mean, in Bitcoin, we've been talking about a spot Bitcoin ETF every year. It seems like it's right around the corner. SEC rejects it for one reason or another. But this time it's BlackRock. And so people are excited about it again. But what do you see as the probabilities that they're actually going to allow this thing to go through? And then maybe what are some of the pros and cons of having a spot Bitcoin ETF in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think the next bull market's going to happen regardless of whether or not there's a spot ETF. This kind of thing I think can just influence the timing and the magnitude of it, because it allows potentially new pools of capital to enter that would otherwise, have to enter slower or in other ways. So in general, I think it would be constructive for price. Um, and as to the odds, I try not to guess these odds. I think we are getting closer. I think that the more iteration you see, especially from these larger entities like BlackRock and Fidelity, it increases the odds of one eventually being approved, because these filings are not just identical filings from years ago. The SEC always gives their reasons for why they turn them down. Whether or not they're valid is another story, but they say, okay, here's the reasons why we turned it down. And so then these filings come along and say, okay, we've addressed the reasons that you've turned the other ones down. And then they can say, well, it's still not quite. So they, okay, that's fine. We iterated again. We went and made it even more specific, right? So it's eventually kind of the SEC gets stuck in a corner where it's like you answered everything they said to do, and they either have to say we don't like Bitcoin, we're not going to approve one, or they just have to capitulate and start allowing a couple of spot Bitcoin ETFs to form. I think one of the funny things is they allowed a leveraged Bitcoin futures ETF, which is clearly a less safe product than a spot Bitcoin ETF. And so it's really hard to be in that environment where you're just always holding back a spot ETF, but you're willing to do a leveraged futures ETF. Um, as for how it's good or bad, I mean, I think, I would not want to see a particularly large percentage of Bitcoin uh, held by, BlackRock and Coinbase and, large entities. Um, Generally, the biggest problem that gold faced is because gold was slow. Gold got centralized and abstracted, and allowed for all sorts of claims to be built on top of it. And those claims were not tested very frequently because most people didn't want to withdraw their gold. They liked having access to the liquidity of a globally interconnected ledger, for lack of a better word. Um, Whereas with Bitcoin, I think the main thing is that it's really easy to test, um, whether or not someone has the Bitcoin they say they do, making sure there's not a lot of IOUs being built on top of it, um, at least relative to the size of the overall market. And so, I think it's better if people self custody or do collaborative custody or do local custody, like let's say Fedimints, things like that. There's a spectrum that people can do rather than these big giant honeypots of like one entity holding millions of people's Bitcoin. But I think that at this stage of adoption, people do want to have it in their brokerage account. They want to have a slice of Bitcoin in a diversified portfolio. And I think to the extent that there are a handful of different ETFs out there, that's good for them. If someone would not buy Bitcoin otherwise, or if the majority of their capital is in their 401k or in their IRA, and they want to have some X% of Bitcoin in there, and that's the majority of their capital, the fact that there's a spot ETF, I think, is a good thing. But in general, it's always going to be an inferior product to the real thing, because the real thing, you can self custody it, you can bring around the entire world with you, you can tip people on Nostr with it, you can do whatever you want to do with it. Whereas when you have it in that ETF form, it's only really good for price. It's more just like strictly an investment, which is a good starting point. But it's just different pools of capital, different products for different pools of capital.